Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I am Uranio Paes.
And today we are talking about the Enneagram types and time management.
Right, the third episode of 3. And we talked on the first one about the head types, the second about the body types, and now the heart types. We did a different order this time. And we had too much to say to put it only in one episode.
Yes.
Right? And I think it's good if we start by saying what is the relationship of time by all heart types. I'll say a few things, and I truly want to hear your opinion.
Okay.
I think that time is very elastic for heart types, depending on how they are feeling, and depending on how they are feeling with the other people they are in. And either they are really more available and willing to spend time and be with, or they are not. So time is very short if they are unhappy, and time is very long if they are happy. Would you agree with this?
I would definitely say that the mood of the person and whether the heart type likes what's happening or doesn't like what's happening plays a role in the perception and experience of time.
For a 3, for instance, it might be felt more like, oh, that person is more negative. I don't like to be around that person. I won't spend as much time. I'll spend more time around that other more positive person. But it's still a little bit about the emotional experience, isn't it?
Right. And I think I would think 3s might be the least likely to inject their feelings into that scenario. For 3s, it might be more like if they're with someone who's competent versus incompetent. If people are wasting their time or not. I know 3s are very sensitive
That's
to that.
That's super important for 3s.
I think maybe more for 2s and 4s, it might be more about like how they feel about what's happening that may influence their perception and experience of time.
But do you think it could be, it makes sense to say that for heart types in general, they can be very flexible with time depending on what's happening emotionally? Like they will spend more time if they are happy with someone or do something for longer because they like what they are doing?
Sure. Yeah. I think if the person likes what's happening, then they may have a perception of wanting to spend more time and not worrying so much about
or liking
time.
something they're doing.
Yeah, sure.
Because I think other types are not as prone to change what they are doing just because they are more happy. I mean, 7s may, but I think it's a bit more of a blind spot for other types that are not heart types. Maybe with the exception of 7, it's not completely like what I'm saying, but I think there is something to heart types that makes time more flexible. They're more flexible with time because of how they are feeling.
Sure.
A bit more. Yeah, just something that's coming to my mind that I wanted to say. And I also think that heart types, they are more flexible naturally when it comes to changing the way they do something, to adapt. They adapt to other people, and perhaps they can be flexible in adapting their agendas and their calendars in ways that accommodate something. I don't think they take time management as rigidly as other people.
Sure. Yeah, I haven't really thought about it, but that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. And what would you say are things that are typical for 2s when it comes to the relationship with time?
Well, like I said in the first podcast in this series, I think 2's orientation to time is more on the present time or the immediate time period we're in, as opposed to focusing on the past or the future. What's kind of right in front of me is something that I focus a lot on. What's happening today, this week, this month. And I guess I would say, I mean, it's interesting thinking about myself. I think my self-preservation dominant instinct plays a big role in my experience. It's a little bit hard to separate that out from the 2.
Right.
Um, I would say that as a 2, I tend to want to like be on time. Now it's funny, I'm always about 5 minutes late, like when I'm actually doing things in the world as opposed to like maybe showing up on Zoom or something. I tend to want to pack a lot of things in. Um, but I'm also sensitive to my impact on other people, right? So I worry a lot about being on time because I don't want to inconvenience someone else. If I'm late and they're waiting for me, that weighs on me.
Right.
So I would say that, and I would also say that I try to do a lot in the time available, and sometimes I'm pushing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I may think I can do a little more than I can actually do in the time available. And I think I factor in how pleasurable something is. I'm starting to sound a little bit like a 7 to myself. But I would say it's more kind of oriented to what's happening now. Am I having fun? I
Mm-hmm.
remember when I was younger, I used to procrastinate a lot, and I would ask myself, like, why do I procrastinate? Because different types can procrastinate. For me, it was always about like if the thing I was doing wasn't that fun or wasn't that compelling, I would want to be doing something else. Or if there's an opportunity to be around someone else or talk to someone I like, it would be hard not to prioritize that
Right.
away from the thing that wasn't really that interesting or fun.
And this is what I was going to ask. It sounds to me what you said now, but also my thoughts, that fun is many, many times related to being with others,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
And relating and exchanging
Mhm.
something.
Mhm.
And that makes you want to do more.
Mhm.
And maybe what you said before could also be a bit like doing too many things, maybe for other people or with other people,
Yeah, it could
perhaps.
be like I'm talking to someone on the phone and it's hard to make a boundary and say I have to get off,
Right.
right? Or being with other people and um, ending something that's a good interaction.
Mm,
I remember when I was a psychotherapist, I really had to learn to end the session on time. That could be sort of hard
right.
because I was empathizing with the person and it felt sometimes too harsh to say, well, we have to stop now. It felt like a
Hmm.
rejection. So
Right.
there's a lot of sensitivity to my impact on others. And I think sometimes that makes it hard to make boundaries, to say no, to say time's up. I have to go now. And so I
Hmm.
think because of that, sometimes interacting with people makes me late or makes me spend more time than I intended.
But then there is also a lot the preference of being with people usually. Of
Yes.
course, you need to like the person and
Yeah.
be in the mood, but
Mhm.
usually. So my point is, I've always noticed with type 2 clients that it would be way harder for them to manage time and keep discipline when they were doing things with
Yeah.
others.
Yeah. Yeah.
When they
Yeah.
are by themselves, it's
Yeah.
a completely different
Yes.
competency
Yeah.
in terms of managing time.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And I mean, I can be when I'm by myself, I think I can look a little more like a 3 maybe,
Hmm.
where I have a list of things that I want to do
I
and I
just
and
do
I
it.
enjoy kind of checking things off the list and
Hmm.
and being competent in that sense of like getting things done.
Hmm.
But when I'm with people, it is kind of a different thing. Now, again, I think becoming a therapist made me better at kind of keeping
Yeah,
that interaction to the
that was
time
developed,
was
not
that was agreed
natural.
on.
Yeah.
That was yes, that was something I had to develop.
So it sounds to me that the whole perception of time, the concept of time changes depending on being with someone else or not. As well as other
Mm,
things, I hear you say that shame depends on having someone else in the room or not, or
Shame?
shame or image, or yeah, let's cut this part. Um, yeah. So yeah, so it depends on having someone in there or not.
Right. Yes.
Hmm.
If there are other people involved or not, that's probably a big dividing line for a two.
Right. What else would you say about time for twos in general, or if there is any subtype difference you think?
I mean, I guess I'm thinking as a 2, I feel like I'm a little bit of a blend of 1 and 3 in some ways
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to time.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate being effective and efficient in the time available. And I can also be a little bit like self-critical of like, oh, I have to be there on time. I can't be late. And so that's something that enforces a kind of rigor when it comes to time. Again, especially if other people are involved. And I like kind of like a three. I like the feeling of using time well. However, I think unlike a three, I'm not as sensitive to other people wasting my time.
Mm.
Like like if I'm having a nice interaction with a person, I'm not thinking of my time being wasted. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, the the person is prioritized over the time period or the schedule.
Yeah.
Whereas I think with threes, they can prioritize
Right.
the sense of I'm being ineffective or
Yeah.
inefficient, I'm not using time well, or this interaction isn't furthering my progress to the goal. Whereas for
Right.
me, I'm not thinking of that as
Right.
much.
And that is
I'm
one.
looser around that.
Right, and that is one way we use to differentiate between twos and threes, like if
Mhm.
task is above relationship
Yes.
or the other way around.
Right.
And I want to say that my experience with type 2 clients is that they are usually the ones that avoid the most using their calendars and in scheduling themselves
Mm.
in things that are too rigid because they want to remain available to
Mm.
people who are coming towards
Mhm.
them. In general, I see that at least in executives.
Yeah, I think it is hard to say no to
Yeah,
people, and so it's hard to say I don't have any time in my schedule for you.
right.
That's a hard thing. So I might like the time available might expand to meet the needs of others. Right
Right,
now, I'm
yeah.
working overtime, or I'm working longer than I would think I would want to, because maybe other people want my time or want something, and that's hard to say no. I do think that I think I'm by nature a busy person, and to some degree I enjoy being busy, although less and less now. And I think there's sometimes I have this feeling like there's not enough hours in the day. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's so many things to do, and I would say including work, but also pleasure,
Right.
and
Twos are
so
very active.
yes, active, I would say that's true.
Yeah. Now, what would be your suggestion, your growth tip for
Mm.
twos listening to us when it comes to time?
I think the biggest thing is learn to make boundaries with people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Learn to say no, learn to really discern between what you really want to do or what your priority is and what you don't want to do. Because I see a lot of twos when I've worked with two clients, especially in the business setting, sometimes the first thing they want to work in on is saying no because they take on too much stuff. And part of what makes them late is not being able to say no to somebody else,
Yeah.
right? So I think getting good at making boundaries, like one of the things I learned from my psychotherapist, how to make boundaries with my clients as a psychotherapist. I
Mm-hmm.
remember
Yeah.
I watched how he was very skillful at the end of a session. Like he'd say something sort of nice, but then he'd sort of segue into, and it's almost time to stop. And so like he would kind of like a couple minutes before the end, he would say it in sort of a nice way and weave it in a way where
Mm-hmm.
it didn't sound too abrupt or
Mm.
too. I remember I had a different psychotherapist, and I really didn't like the way he did it. It was sort of like almost like he was a machine,
Yeah.
like it's time to stop,
Yeah.
in the middle of a sentence.
I
So
think you learned really well. I admire you a lot in how you do that when working with people in courses.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I think it's getting graceful around that, but not giving up yourself too much where I don't know how to say no, I'm over empathizing with the other. So I just give away all my time and I don't manage what I'm doing with more intention and with my own needs in mind. So I think that, if twos really focus on how to make that boundary, and I think how to set aside time for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
so they're not giving away all their time to other people or
Right.
other things or doing more than they really want to be doing. I think that's a challenge.
And do you think it's possible, or is there a way for choose to concentrate a bit more on the tasks and a bit less on people? It's not easy.
You mean focus more on tasks and less on people?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I think it's focusing more on our own agenda, a
Yeah.
little bit like nines.
Hmm.
Nines have the same problem, I think.
Yeah.
I remember working with nines as clients who were therapists or coaches themselves. And they would tell me, oh, I go like half an hour over time when I work with clients.
Imagine
And
in Brazil.
yeah, yes, Brazilians, yes,
Mm.
even if they're fives, that could happen.
Yes, exactly.
So I think it's
Uh,
it's it's putting yourself in the equation, and I think having your own task needs in the forefront of your mind, and balancing your need to please others or not reject others with your own needs for your own time management and your own time off and your own free time and your own time to do what you want to do. I think if you really focus on that, then it makes everything easier.
right. Yes. Okay, let's move on to 3.
Okay.
I think threes try to make everything fit in the short amount of time they have, and they usually would like the day to have 25 or to 30 hours to fit even more.
Right. And probably threes might be very near the top of the list of people types that are most time sensitive, right?
Hmm.
They're always thinking
Yes.
in terms of time. And I think their sense of time and time management is completely connected to their goals.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're always sort of aiming for a goal, they're always mapping out the pathway to get that goal, how long it's going to take them, what they need to do to get there. And of course, they have many goals, right?
Hmm.
And so I think threes are always really focused on getting the absolute most done in the amount of time available, which is part of why they're so sensitive to people wasting their time.
Right.
Right. And they can get really impatient. Sometimes when people ask about type 3 and anger, I often say, well, I think mainly they get impatient, and sometimes anger is caused by impatience or
Yeah.
by people wasting their time.
Yeah.
And I think they are always calculating in their mind, like how much time they need and how much time is available, trying to stretch that time, but also getting good at being very efficient at
Hmm.
using time, so that they can do the most they can in the time that they have available and get to the goal and finish the task.
Right. Totally agree. And I've always observed, for instance, in type threes doing strategic plans, they found it really hard to have a concept of what's going to happen in 6 months, then in 1 year, in 2 or 3. They wanted everything to happen in the 6 months, right? So
Interesting.
it's
Yeah.
very hard for them to do
Wow.
that.
Yeah.
So I need to get to the best possible place
Mhm.
as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why threes and sevens look so much alike is because of time. Not
Hmm.
so where they differ is that sevens focus a lot on the future, and for threes, I think it's more like what's in front of them and the tasks
Hmm.
and goals and the
Yeah.
timelines in front of them. But I think they are fast paced like sevens,
Yeah.
and I also think they can be very very focused on. Um, using their time well,
Hmm.
in order to get the thing done.
Optimizing
Oh, and
things.
multitasking, like doing,
Multitasking, yeah.
even if it means doing three or four things at the same time.
Right. Yeah. I remember a type 3 CEO from a company. He said, when I go to the gym, I do two kinds of stretches in my body at the same time because I can't waste time.
Right,
So, yeah.
right. And it's funny because just before you said that, I was thinking of, I used to do Bikram yoga,
Hmm.
and Bikram yoga and I always thought it was such a three type of yoga because they say you're doing three or four things all at once. You're working on flexibility, strength, but also like losing weight and sweating and things like that. So it's like, how can I do the most things at the same time
Right.
to get the absolute most out of my time?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like I'll connect to my kid by taking the kid to work with me one day. Like,
Right,
yeah,
right,
I
right.
saw many times threes doing that.
Wow.
Yeah. I also think that there is a tendency to try to overcome the fact that time passes by slowly.
Right.
I mean, go really fast, a fast pace throughout the day, and speeding up all the time.
Right. And you're reminding me of also, I remember a long time ago, I worked as a waitress in a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes after work, like after the lunch shift, I would go to have a drink with some of my fellow waiters, right? And there was this woman who I think was a 3, and she was so funny. We would go out to have like a beer after work, and she would set an alarm because after an hour or an hour and 15 minutes she would have to go do something, and I thought she was a 3 because it's like, okay, I can have this beer and have fun, but then I need to stop at this very particular time and go do other things.
Yeah, it also sounds like goals, right? So
Yes.
I need everything is set in terms of goals,
Yes.
which means deadlines,
Yes.
which means quantity,
Right. And working back from the goal
Yeah.
of, okay, I have this much time for this and this much time for this. And sometimes time is very rigidly allocated in
Mhm.
order to line up with the goal and the timeline and what needs to be done.
Yeah.
I remember another thing I noticed about 3s at one point is like 2 or 3 different 3s I knew all told the same story of how when this was back when people were actually going to work, driving to work, they would figure out the route to work, to drive to work, that was the absolute quickest. Right?
Yes.
Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
How can I take the absolute minimum amount of time to get from A to B?
Yes, I have always seen that. And I think that when it comes to managing time, there is a trap that I see 3s falling into all the time. It's like, I'll be more productive. Like I will manage time so that I'll be even more productive and do even more things, which is not really the more modern concept of time management.
Right.
Time management has to do with quality of life and life balance, work-life balance. And then when 3s want to invest in work-life balance, a better one, I remember a friend of mine, 3, when she had a daughter, she started studying theories that said that the quality of her presence with her daughter was the most important thing. So 10 minutes per day with the highest quality possible would be perfect. And that fit her really well, because she would feel too guilty if she didn't spend too much time, but she couldn't spend much time. But then she would do all to be completely there with her daughter for 10 minutes.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think work-life balance is always a hard thing, a hard challenge for 3s. And so I think we've been talking a lot about the 3 personality, but what do you think are some growth tips for 3s when it comes to time, given that they have maybe the hardest time becoming more flexible, like changing their habits around time, because they're so oriented toward being successful and getting results, and they get a lot of rewards for being as efficient as they are.
So I have a radical suggestion, that the 3s do not use to-do lists.
Uh-oh.
That they use just the calendar itself.
I don't know if that's a hard sell.
And that they leave at least an hour free during the day for people to reach out to them. A little bit what I said to 5s 2 episodes ago.
Do they tell people this? Do they say like office hours? I mean, is this something that they advertise, or how does that work? I don't really understand it.
I'm used to seeing 3s scheduling them up in all possible ways and never having availability for someone who needs them all of a sudden, or open space just to talk, or to just dedicate time to relationships. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, put things in the calendar and not in a big to-do list. I think 3s get too addicted to doing because they have a to-do list. Of course, this is a personality thing. They will always go to doing and less being than doing. But I think that if they don't use to-do lists, it gets better.
That is radical.
It is very radical
Yeah.
for threes. I know. I
I don't
know.
know if they could. I don't know many threes that could even imagine not having to
Yeah,
do that.
I think the thing is they don't like the limitation of the calendar that says you have from this time to that time.
Right.
So they will go beyond that by using a list that has no limits called
Right.
to-do list.
Right.
Right? So I'm suggesting that threes face the limitation of time
Mhm.
by using the calendar only
Right.
and allocating things. And then they will see, look, this is not working.
Right. And I think allocating more time for fun, for
Yeah.
being with people, for
Hmm.
relationships, and the hard part there is I had a friend once, a three, who sometimes like we would meet for, let's say, dinner or a drink or something, and we'd be talking, and to her credit, she would say, like in the middle, she'd say, I'm noticing I'm having a really hard time focusing on what you're saying because I'm thinking of something I have to do tomorrow. You know what I mean? And I think that's the tricky
Uh,
thing. But I think if threes do focus on having time where they're not doing anything, or when
yeah,
they're just doing something for pleasure, or
yeah,
just watching TV, or being with people and really trying to really be there and create more space. I think that's really healthy for them, but of course I think very challenging.
yeah. So one thing I observe with threes also is that when they get back home after work, they also do stuff, but there is a certain point that they collapse in front of the TV
Hmm.
and they are like useless. They can't do anything else. It's like complete going to nine and that
Right.
arrow to nine
Yeah.
in the worst possible way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And or they can just go sleep and collapse just by sleeping. And I think threes need to find the middle way. They
Hmm.
need to find that time that they won't try to be as productive,
Hmm.
as efficient, and they will still be participating and doing a few things.
Hmm.
But slowing down pace, truly,
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think that's useful.
Yeah, yeah, slowing down, leaving space for just not doing much, or being with people, or just being present in their relationships.
Yeah, yeah, and breathing more slowly. I think it's a great idea also for
Yes,
threes.
yes, yes, yes.
Should we talk about fours?
Yes,
Yeah, I think it really changes the according to subtype
I agree.
here
Yeah.
when it comes to time management
Yes,
and the
yes,
experience of time.
yes,
For instance, you can have a very patient social four and a very impatient sexual four,
yes, yes,
right?
yes, yes.
And
I think sexual fours in this respect, when it comes to time, can look a lot like threes.
exactly, yeah,
Very
yeah.
active energy, doing a lot,
Mhm.
being people who want to prove themselves as being superior or special, and so
Yeah.
may schedule a lot and do a lot.
Right, yes. And I think the pace can also change a lot
Yes.
for fours. I think self-press fours, sexuals tend to have a high pace,
Yes.
but then social fours tend to have a slow pace.
Yes. Yes. More in
Um,
their emotions, less in their tasks, maybe.
right. But in general, I think that fours lose touch with time. I think it's something from that bottom or the southern part of the Enneagram, fours and
Mm-hmm.
fives. It's
Mm-hmm.
harder for those two types to have a better sense of timing passing
Mm-hmm.
by.
Yeah.
And I think that being in the inner world too much
Mm-hmm.
doesn't give fours the right sense of time.
Right. It's like sometimes we talk about subjective time versus objective time. Like the objective time might be like the
Yeah.
time that's actually on the clock, right?
Hmm.
But subjective time is what time feels like,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Something, it can feel like that last half an hour took like 5 hours, or it can feel like a half an hour
Yeah.
took a half an hour.
Yes, yes. And I think that also, um, I could say that at times I see fours that develop a process orientation that is brilliant. They
Mm.
start really looking like ones,
Mm.
and usually in a way that's pretty healthy for them,
Right.
because they tame their excessive emotional energy by
Mm-hmm.
doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I see that fours become brilliant in terms of the concept of time.
Mm-hmm.
But still, when they are by themselves, they go deeply inside themselves, and then they go to abstractions, and they lose touch with time,
Mm-hmm.
and with the time as it is, the
Mm-hmm.
real concept of time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think subjectivity is big for
Right, right,
force,
right. Self-referencing, in
self-referencing.
inner living in the inner world, and whatever's going on in there can greatly color the experience of time for the four,
Yeah,
and what they're feeling like, who they're with. Maybe a little bit like twos, whether they like what they're doing or dislike what they're doing, how emotionally involved they are. Those kinds of things can impact their experience a lot.
yes. And I think there is something I noticed with some fours, that is, um, they don't think they are taking as much time when they talk about themselves as
Mm-hmm.
the experience of other people about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people think that they take a lot of time talking about themselves or being self-referencing,
Right.
but they don't see that. They think
Yes.
that they are not taking that much time.
Right,
Do
right,
you
right,
notice
right.
this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Focusing a lot on themselves, and if they're talking about themselves, they may, enjoy the time. Whereas if different things are going on, that maybe it's not so much about them, then maybe they can be maybe more impatient. Let's say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that it's a bit hard for force to just pay attention to what's happening with the other person.
Mm.
They can be very empathetic, but at times they are doing that as in, let me see how I would feel in that
Right,
case. So
right.
bringing back
Yes.
inside.
Yeah.
So I see that actually force can be impatient when it comes to other people sharing or other people having their needs.
Yeah.
It's a bit uncomfortable for force. They
Mm-hmm.
tend to bring that inside themselves. Or if
Mm-hmm.
they are listening with that agenda of comparing themselves.
Right,
Right?
right, right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's a little bit like maybe that joke of, now that I've talked a lot about me, what do you think of me?
Yeah.
Now that I've taken all this time talking about what I think, what do you think about me? Yeah,
Mm,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
The self-referencing tendency can be big, but yeah, I do think for self-preservation fours, for instance, they can also look like threes or ones, be very hardworking, and some ways be more tuned in to others, like we talked about with twos, like be
Mm,
like not want to inconvenience others. And they also, of course, have a masochistic tendency and take on a lot,
yeah.
and can work very hard without limit, which might be a little bit three-ish as well.
Now, you also say something really important about self-press force, which is the long suffering.
Right.
So, do you think that self-press force lose touch with how long they have been holding on to some episode of suffering?
Definitely. I mean, I think self preservation fours, they just have a high pain threshold, and they may not listen to themselves in terms of things that are uncomfortable or too much or things like that. And so they may like work way too hard and not recognize their body signals that tell them that, hey, you need a break, or you need to stop or slow down, that those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things. They can be, the three is doing it for a different reason, to be successful or complete the task or get to the goal. Whereas the self-pres four, it's more about proving myself and enduring.
Mm-hmm.
And they can tend to work too hard and not make enough time for themselves, not make enough time for fun or pleasure or relaxation. But it's more about that sort of intensity of, I'm going to, really do what I do with a big effort, and not recognize my
Mm.
limits.
Right, right. Yeah, in terms of hints for force on
Mm.
how to better deal with time, I think an actual control of time, like for how
Mm.
long am I going to do something, like
Right.
stay in touch with my emotions right now, and I need to stop because in an hour I have something to do.
Right, maybe get more tuned into objective time, like,
Right.
or the calendar or the
Chronos
schedule.
itself.
Yeah, being
Yes.
more mindful of how long do I really want to spend on this, or how much time do I want to devote to someone else,
Yeah.
and being more mindful of those choices and making more balanced choices.
Yeah, I don't know if you know those two ways of controlling time. One is chronos and the other one is kairos, and that
Hmm.
is more quantitative and qualitative
So which is
concept of
which?
time.
Just maybe
Chronos
explain
is the
that.
quantitative,
Quantitative, yeah.
and
So how much time, actually minutes or
I
hours?
think fours need more of that.
Uh-huh.
The actual chronos,
And
and
the
not
other one is
the
subjective, like
perceived
subjective
sense of
time.
time, more subjective and
Hmm.
yeah, more
Hmm.
qualitative.
Hmm.
There would be more to say about this. I
Yeah.
don't want to go too much into that, but I think fours are a lot about losing touch with the actual sense of time. So
Right.
fours are the people who said, really, I thought last time we had seen each other was just 2 years ago. I can't believe it's 10 years ago, because
Hmm.
it's way more about the
Colored by the
experience.
emotion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that while we suggested for a
Mm-hmm.
few types that they get rid of the clock, I think
Mm-hmm.
fours need one.
Right, right. And I think it's also like fours benefit from like a good move to type one, the arrow line connection to one, where ones can be a little more mindful of time
Yeah,
around like things implementing an idea and how
right.
much time do we really need and how much
Yeah.
time is allocated for this task.
Hmm.
And even though ones have their own issues with time, I think for a four going to one, it's like being more practical, being
Exactly.
thinking things through. How long does something really take? And
Hmm.
what are the steps in this process, and
Yeah.
how can I allocate time, and again, not do it from an excessively creative outlook or an excessively emotionally tinged outlook. and
Yeah.
and like for a social four, recognizing that, okay, there may accounting for an emotional bias when
Hmm.
it comes to how they spend their time or how they perceive time.
Yeah, having appointments and a full calendar and being a bit busy is good. I mean,
Yeah.
not the self-press for busy thing.
Right. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
like busy as in I have my inner process going on, but I need to do this in the
Yes,
next half
yes.
hour. That's
Yeah,
super useful.
exactly. Being a little more mindfully task focused so that the,
Hmm.
the emotions don't fill up all the space
Exactly.
or
Yeah.
take over the perception of what's happening time wise.
And I think that is my suggestion for first in terms of how to grow in using time management. It's really being more disciplined
Right.
and having things that you need to do and avoid postponing them because of your mood, because of your emotional
Right.
state.
That's exactly it. Yeah, like I know when I worked with social fours, for instance, as a therapist, and I had social four clients, like a lot of what they would come to work on was, for instance, I really want to write this book, but I can't make myself do it,
Yes. Yes.
and so getting more practical about how they spend their
Right.
time. I also think we mentioned in the first podcast in this series, where we kind of did a more general introduction to the types and time and their perception of time, that fours tend to be more oriented to the past,
Mhm.
but they also can, sort of be nostalgic, and also, if only this had happened in the past, things would be better. And also think about an idealized future sometimes. So
Mhm.
I think it's important for fours also to balance themselves in that sense of
Mhm.
like not give too much weight to the past, bring
Mhm.
themselves more what's
Yeah.
happening now really in the present,
Mhm.
and sometimes focusing more on what's good that's happening now in
Yeah.
the present, instead of always looking at what's missing or what you feel is lacking or feeling
Mhm.
like you're not enough in the moment. Really having a more balanced outlook of like, okay, well, if you aren't where you want to be, maybe you can take steps to get to where you want to be, and maybe think about how much
Mhm.
time that would take you, and be a little bit more realistic and
Right.
not so much sort of swept away by a feeling of
Of that.
of that.
Yeah, I think focusing on what's the very next thing is very useful.
Yes.
Yeah, in the sense of what you're bringing up right now. I also think, B, that I see many fours unscheduling things a bit more easily than other people do because of something that's happening or how
Yes.
they are feeling. And I
Yes.
think it's good to add some rigidity
Mm-hmm.
to your own process if you're a four.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Don't allow yourself to play with your calendar that much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or you're feeling bad, and so you're taking a lot of time off. You know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yeah.
It's like a little too indulgent of that
Hmm.
sense of like, oh, I can't really do it. I'm not really up to it. Um,
Let time help you control your emotions instead of emotions control time.
well said. Exactly. I think that's a good summary.
Okay. So anything else to add about fours or about the heart types in when it comes to time? It was fun to talk about this theme. I think
Yeah.
we started thinking this would be a one podcast, but it got really clear that we had too much content to put in one podcast only.
Yes,
And then
but we did make a mistake perhaps in starting with five because that took a really long time because of all the weirdness of all the funniness about
well,
fives and head types in time.
well, hopefully our listeners found it useful.
Yes.
I remembered so many important things, and I think this, mastering how each type relates with time is something that is really useful when it
Yeah.
comes to self
Development.
understanding,
Yeah.
self development. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it points to things like mindfulness and intentionality. And because I think, the whole idea behind the Enneagram is that we fall asleep. And I think we can fall asleep and be sort of driven by unconscious habit, and time goes by, and we wake up and it's like, whoa, where did the
Hmm.
time go? So
Yeah.
I think it is a good topic to remind us that in this dimension that we find ourselves in, this plane of human reality, we have time. And,
Hmm.
from higher dimensions, time doesn't exist, but it does exist here for us. And so it helps us to be more aware and awake to the aspect of time and what our habits are and our tendencies, so that we can not be swept away by our
Right.
tendencies.
Yeah, and I think it's a especially useful theme for us to control our type biases.
Yes, yes. And potentially in the new year, when people are thinking about resolutions and what they want to do differently,
Hmm.
this can be a very important feature of, being really, really aware of how you want to manage time in the new year going forward, so that you can meet new goals or do things in a better way with a lot of conscious intention.
Very well. Thank you for all this interesting sharing.
Yes, and that does it for this episode of Enneagram 2.0. We hope that you will join us next time for our next podcast where we talk about all things Enneagram.